still being committed today. Now you will hear from survivors, from themselves, really about what they like to see as a form of reparations, as what they need to rebuild their lives. So the study really focused on that, their perspectives, their priorities. What I want to say is that when I was in Kiev earlier this year,
Recording in progress.
Okay. Recording has started. What I want to say is that when I was in Kiev earlier this year, that really struck with me was the very concrete things actually that survivors are asking as a form of reparations now, but also on the longer term. One of these things is health insurance, for example, or something else very concrete, hearing that it is not their fault. What I also felt really stands out, and you see that in the report, is the call for the urgency, not to postpone reparations till there is a resolution of the conflict. Urgent reparations, such as financial support, they can really help victims overcome that first period following sexual violence, which is deeply traumatizing. And it's really when victims try to grapple with the pieces of their lives that are often completely shattered. So this study is a mobilization of survivors' voices, but it's also a call for action. While ultimately the state responsible for the violations should also be held responsible to pay for reparations, and that is in this case the Russian Federation, the pathway to get there, as we all know, is very long. And in that sense, we've been extremely encouraged by the willingness of the Ukrainian government to mobilize support for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. This is really a unique opportunity to show the world that what a timely, constructive governmental response to reparations can look like with support from the international community, and that's important. I really want to thank our partners from Ukraine, Bird and also the Eastern-Ukrainian Center for Civic Initiatives, EUCCI, and Truth Hounds for working together with us on this study, and for some of you for making the journey to Geneva, despite the difficulties that you're facing in your home country. And finally, I want to thank survivors of sexual violence in Ukraine for your courage and for your determination in participating in this study, but also welcome to those survivors that are present here today with us. Going forward, lastly, survivors really need to remain the key actors in determining what reparations will look like in Ukraine. Thank you very much for joining us, everyone, and wishing you a very fruitful dialogue.
Thank you very much, Esther. And as you said, the survivor voices are key to this study and are key to any viable reparation process. And we are very humbled and honored to have here Ms. Irina Dovgany, who's a survivor herself and who really empowers those victimized both since 2014 and since February this year to come up, speak, and actively contribute to the formulation of the reparations policies. Irina, over to you.
Доброго дня, мене звуть Ірина Довгань, я є учасницею і я стою на початку заснування СЕМА Україна. Я хочу висказати великі слова подяки засновникам міжнародної мережі СЕМА, тому що, мабуть, жертви або виживши Вибачте. Мене звуть Ірина Довгань. І я учасниця і засновниця мережі української частини мережі СЕМА. Я хочу, по-перше, подякувати міжнародній організації СЕМА за те, що
Perhaps shall I translate while we are setting up, right?
Добре.
Мене звати пані Ірина Довгань, я є засновницею мережі СЕМА Україна. Це організація, яка представляє інтереси жінок, які постраждали від сексуального насильства в російсько-українському збройному. Oh, I'm sorry, it should be English. I'm so sorry. My name is Irina Dovgany. I'm a founder of SEMA Network Ukraine, the organization that unites the female survivors of conflict-related sexual violence of the Russia-Ukraine armed conflict.
По-перше, я б хотіла подякувати міжнародній мережі СЕМА за те, що
It's now there. The English translation is there.
Я б хотіла подякувати міжнародній мережі СЕМА за те, що вони навчили українських жінок, виживших, заговорити про це. Бо не зрозуміло, скільки би років ми ще мовчали. Якби не приклад інших країн, і якби нас дійсно не навчили відкритися і заговорити про це. Конфлікт в Україні триває з 2014 року. З 2014 року території Донбасу вже окуповані. Я є однією з жінок, якій вдалося вижити, яка по волі щасливого случая була звільнена, залишилась жива і може вам зараз щось розповісти. Але я хочу також сказати, що з 2014 року окуповані Росією території Донбасу, вони реально непідконтрольні і недоступні для жодної з правозахисних організацій світу. І ми можемо тільки представити, скільки жертв насильства і взагалі жертв знаходиться досі на тих територіях, і чи зможуть бути колись доказані ці злочини. Але нова хвиля агресії Росії зараз відкрила всьому світу, як вони це роблять. І території, які були окуповані з початку конфлікту всього лише 1 місяць, зараз стали доступні правозахисникам, журналістам всього світу. І весь світ на власні очі побачив, що залишається після втручання Росії на чужі території. Я б хотіла сказати, що мені дуже боляче, що ми свідчили, але мало хто чув нас з 2014 року. І це велика рана у всіх нас, що тільки такою великою кров'ю нас почули за останні 3-4 місяці загострення цього конфлікту. Ми тут зібралися для того, щоб поговорити про репарації для жертв. І мені є що сказати, бо ми багато про це розмовляли з жінками, які є членами СЕМи. І у кожної жінки є своє бачення цих репарацій. Це ніколи не буває однаковим для всіх. Але те, що однаково для всіх, це бажання того, щоб злочинці були покарані. Це перша і надважливіша частина репарацій. Бо ми всі живемо в такому стані, що ми знаємо, що вони себе добре почувають, і вони знову і знову роблять ці злочини, тому що вони не покарані. І дуже жаль, що навіть в такій розвинутій країні, як Україна, не було якогось визнання того, що ці жертви існують. Дуже повільно держава взагалі це визнавала. Дуже повільно робилися якісь справи, і знову-таки завдяки СЕМі Україна і проведеним нами західам ми змогли заявити про себе на всю державу. Ми провели круглий стол, і нас почули представники Генеральної прокуратури, і нарешті з 21-го року в Україні почались справи по розслідуванню цих злочинів. І всі жінки дали свідчення. Але зараз знову кровава хвиля війни і нові жертви. І я останнє, що зараз хочу сказати. Репарації – це дуже справедливо. Але зараз в Україні гостра фаза війни. І всі присутні в залі, будь ласка, зробіть кожен хоч щось для того, щоб зупинити цю криваву війну в Україні. Інакше тих жертв, яким потрібні будуть репарації, з кожним днем стає все більша і більша кількість. Я дуже хвилююся, що нам не вистачить тих заарештованих російських грошей, щоб якось компенсувати таку велику кількість жертв. Вибачте.
Irina, thank you so much for your poignant just insight and your recommendations to the community to see how justice is important to survivors and how much the rebuilding of Ukraine is much beyond the rebuilding of the infrastructure, but it's about the help to individual survivors. And here I'm glad to welcome Mariam Kitia, the Belgian Minister of Development, Cooperation and of Mayor Cities, please.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, dear attendees. Once again, we are facing the horror of sexual violence used as a weapon of war, and this time in Ukraine. It even goes beyond the meaning of the word horror and crosses all the red lines of humanity. Reports of rape and other forms of sexual violence against women, men, and even children that we hear from Ukraine are rising fast, and it might for now even be only the top of the iceberg. When visiting the Panzi Hotel in Congo, I talked directly to survivors of sexual violence in the eastern part of Congo. And the stories that they told me are sadly very similar to what we hear coming from Ukraine. They are unacceptable and revolting. But I was also impressed though by the resilience and the strength of these Congolese women. And I have no doubt about the resilience and the strength of the Ukrainian women. Women have shown these months once again that they are the symbol and the impersonation of that strength of a nation on the doors, but a nation including its women and girls standing tall in the face of aggression. You are admired for your strength and resilience. Despite suffering, you use your energy to help other people. You create links and networks to give hope and repair what can be repaired. So the Belgian government stands with Ukrainian people, especially women and girls, and against conflict-related sexual violence. Supporting women and girls is at the very heart of all my policy. And as Dr. McQuiggy likes to say, saving a woman is saving a nation. Therefore, I wish to express my sincere gratitude and admiration for the work of all the actors and grassroots organizations who are involved in responding to conflict-related sexual violence. The results of the study to be presented today will be precious and will provide us with the necessary evidence to better respond to the needs of the Ukrainian people and women in particular. Reparation is one of the most difficult aspects of the response, but it's also an important one. It is a matter of recognition for the damage, the griefs, the losses, and the trauma. Therefore, I would like to thank the Global Survivor Funds for this opportunity to give a voice to these strong Ukrainian women and bring awareness of the horror and the scale of sexual violence, as well as the need to tackle accountability, to assure victim support, and to take action to tackle stigma. You have shown great results with your work in other countries like DRC, Guinea, and in Iraq. Today, it is of utmost importance to use your expertise in Ukraine as well. And this is why I'm looking into further supporting the very important work of the Global Survivor Funds. The international community and civil society they can count on the continuing support of Belgium in the efforts to prevent and to respond to conflict-related sexual violence. Thank you very much for listening, and I wish you all a very productive side event.
Thank you very much, Minister. It's very hopeful to hear about this hopefully cohorted effort of Ukraine, its international partners, Global Survivors Fund, and of course, survivors themselves at the core of the justice and reparations initiatives. And now we will hear from the representative of Ukraine, Ms. Evgenia Filipenko, who is the permanent representative of Ukraine to the United Nations agencies, and she's joining us online.
Distinguished guests and colleagues, as the entire Ukraine is bleeding, the Russian army continues to apply the most barbaric and inhumane tactics of warfare, using sexual violence as instruments of terror to control and intimidate civilian population. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights received hundreds of reports of acts of sexual violence, mostly against women and girls, and a national hotline documented crimes ranging from gang rape to coercion to watch an act of sexual violence committed against the loved ones or children. According to the Minister of the Interior, minors and elderly women, as well as men and boys, were also among the victims of the Russian rapists. Fatalities have also been registered. Conflict-related sexual violence perpetrated by the Russian forces in Ukraine have devastating effects on individuals, families, and society. The full scale of this violence is yet to be estimated, as for every person willing to tell their story, there are many others who will be silent for years. Ensuring accountability for the perpetrators, as well as reparations and support for the victims of this CRSV, are Ukraine's priority. To this end, the government of Ukraine stands ready to work in partnership with international partners and civil society, and we encourage close coordination in follow-up to this study. We welcome the work of the Global Survivors Fund, the Eastern-Ukrainian Center for Civic Initiatives, Bird and Truth Hounds in Ukraine, and the study presented today as an important step towards delivering justice and remedy. Unable to join today's event in person, I would like to wish participants a fruitful discussion and thank organizers and co-sponsors for their tireless work and attention to this challenging topic at this unprecedented time of resistance of my country. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Filipenko and colleagues. We are now turning to the first panel discussion that will look into the needs of survivors of concentrated sexual violence in Ukraine and their perception of reparations. And I kindly invite Ms. Marina Chuykova, Amal Nasser, Natalia Melnik to the podium, and Ms. Katerina Levchenko will join us online. Ms. Marina Chuykova is also a member of the SEMA network and a survivor herself. And Марино, якщо можна, ми почнемо саме з вас, і ми б хотіли більше почути про ваш досвід і про те, які потреби у вас та ваших колежанок з мережі СЕМА наразі існують щодо репарацій. Спасибі.
Спасибо, что дали мне такую возможность. Я Марина Чуйкова, я с Украины. Я родилась в город Горловка, Донецкая область. Мама 2 детей. Для меня война началась в 2014 году на Донбассе. Авиаудары, бомбежки, разрушения, смерть, ужас. Все это... При этом всем гибли люди. Очень много людей гибли люди, гибли дети. Это было очень страшно. Я оставалась дома. Я помогала военным Украины. Я хотела, чтобы война не пошла дальше. За мою позицию оккупанты бросили меня на подвал. 655 дней ада с пытками, унижениями, оскорблениями. Меня возили на подвал вместе с другими женщинами, которых тоже мучили. Отпустить предлагали за деньги, назывались огромные цены. Освободили меня путем обмена. Я вышла. Какой я вышла? Мне нужна была медицинская помощь, психологическая помощь, стоматологическая помощь, юридическая помощь, деньги. Ведь все у меня забрали террористы. С чего начинать, как жить, где жить, нет жилья, ничего нет. Президент Украины выделил нам некоторую материальную помощь и организовал диагностику в хорошей больнице. Блакитный птах организация предоставила бесплатно психолога, который немножечко поднял меня на ноги. Волонтеры помогли едой, одеждой, необходимыми вещами и лекарствами. Организация СЕМА, которая собрала нас вместе, женщин, которые пострадали от сексуально-гендерного насилия во время войны, с общими темами для обсуждений, могли делиться своими успехами в адаптации и реабилитации. Мы учились вместе на тренингах, мы отдыхали, мы общались, мы осваивали новые профессии, новые навыки. Так я возвращалась к новой жизни для меня. Но здесь, в феврале, Россия снова вторглась, и моя жизнь снова масштабно перевернулась. Мое жилье разбито, и у меня нет дома. Я вынуждена выехать в Германию. И что будет со мной, я не знаю. Где я буду жить, за что я буду жить. Я не знаю языка, и мне уже 50 лет. Как будет потом, что будет завтра? Поэтому я хочу сказать, что очень важно, чтобы в этот момент, в такую трудную минуту, был кто-то рядом из людей, чтобы помогли, чтобы подсказали, чтобы протянули руку помощи. Вот так начинается у меня новая жизнь. 50.
Марина, дякую вам неймовірно за те, що ви ділитесь своєю історією, що це такий неймовірний приклад просто життєствердження, і те, що ви так ємко окреслили всі потреби, з якими стикаються потерпілі, від сталої, неразової, медичної, психологічної, юридичної допомоги. І, звісно, те, що ви житло, і те, що ви надихаєте інших говорити про це. І I particularly would like to point out that Marina has been speaking in Russian, so this whole narrative that is oftentimes used in the Russian media, that there is a certain persecution of the Russian-speaking people, you can see that it's proven wrong. I'm now turning to my great colleague Amal Nasser, who is the lead author of this study. And Amala, we would be very interested to hear from you how much this personal experience of Marina resembles the larger scale of the needs of the survivors in Ukraine.
Thank you so much, Katerina. And I'd like to start by expressing that it was a deep honor for me to be working on this study with survivors. Some of them are here with us today. With the Ukrainian partner, the EUCCI, Bird, who are here with us today, but also with Truth Hounds, who couldn't, unfortunately, join us, but they are with us online. I also want to quickly acknowledge the third co-author of the report, so the third in addition to myself and Katerina, Alexa Sidou-Jartowski, who I believe is also with us online. And Katerina, I'll perhaps first say how moving it was to listen to Marina describe very accurately, very clearly the needs of survivors. And that is precisely what we sought to do in the study. This is a study that was conducted in a survivor-centered approach, where we put the voices, the needs and demands of survivors at the center of the report. It is their voice that we are seeking to display and amplify. And this approach is not only necessary, it is essential, because when we talk about responses for conflict-related sexual violence, we must engage those affected by those very same crimes and consult them and engage them on what is needed as a response. If we do not do that, not only do we risk putting in place the wrong response, but we also deprive survivors the opportunity to gain their agency as rights holders and to exercise their rights, and specifically the right to reparation. Thank you so much, Katya. And I just want to summarize it actually by a quote from one of the survivors who participated in the study. She said, "Why for us, but without us?" And that is a clear call for all of us working on the conflict in Ukraine and on conflict-related sexual violence to engage survivors on all responses put in place. So we had the participation of 27 survivors in the study. 22 were women and 5 were men. And those survivors all participated in the study through responding to a questionnaire that was either conducted in an interview, an individual interview, or it was in a group discussion. And this questionnaire, it was developed by the Global Survivors Fund, but we made sure to also adapt it and make it appropriate to the Ukrainian context. And we did that through consulting our partners in the study, but also consulting survivors to make sure that the language we are using is appropriate, is trauma-informed, and is fit for the context and the work we are trying to do. Before I tell you about the findings, I also want to stress that the whole process was not only survivor-centered, it was also trauma-informed. We didn't just seek to get this input from survivors, we also made sure that we are not harming them. So we made sure that there was psychological support as part of the interviews and the group discussion, and Natalia will expand on this point. But we also wanted to make sure that this entire research also contributes in raising awareness of the right to reparation, including amongst survivors themselves. So this questionnaire that we administered really sought to understand the impact of conflict-related sexual violence on survivors, but also on their families and societies. And then we wanted to understand what is their vision, what are their demands in terms of reparations, and what are their immediate needs. And many of the needs that Marina mentioned, the social, economic, medical, psychological, were described by all survivors who participated in the study. It is really not the experience of one survivor, it is the experience of all survivors. And those are urgent needs that we need to respond to with great urgency, in fact, immediately. Survivors also not only wanted these needs to be addressed, they really wanted to have acknowledgement that conflict-related sexual violence is indeed taking place in the conflict since 2014, and they wanted acknowledgement of them as survivors of the harms they have experienced. And an acknowledgement was, in fact, the starting point for them for reparations. They wanted to be seen. They did not want their experiences to be invisible, and they wanted to be recognized as agents of change. Reparations were described by survivors to be the continuation and completion of justice. They described that it should include compensation for the harms they have experienced, for the losses that they have gone through. Like Marina said, they lost housing, they lost jobs, they lost entire, not just material losses, of course, there are also moral losses that they had to go through. They also wanted rehabilitation to be an integral part of reparation, but they also wanted measures for accountability, that perpetrators are prosecuted and brought to justice. But importantly, they wanted guarantees that sexual violence will not be repeated. One survivor said that she does not want this to be the experience of her child. She wants war to end, and she does not want her child to see sexual violence happen again. The final point that I wanted to describe as conveyed by survivors is that they see that the Ukrainian government, and it was great, in fact, hear it from the Ukrainian government today, that it should be the Ukrainian government who is putting in place a reparation program, but it should be Russia who is ultimately also paying as a party and a responsible party for this violation. And that is also described in the study on how the international community can make that happen, because Russia is as we all would agree, will not do that voluntarily. Finally, up to this year, perhaps, our assessment of what is available in terms of reparation are smaller pieces of responding to survivors' needs, some financial forms of financial assistance, but there remains no comprehensive policy for remedy and reparations for all victims of the conflict, including victims of conflict-related sexual violence. And that is what survivors would like to see and what we hope to achieve through this study. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amal, and thank you at pointing of this important harmony, because on the one hand, having a holistic approach to reparations, but on the other hand, to also understand the particular needs of particular groups of those victimized. And I'm now turning to Ms. Наталія Мельник. Наталія Мельник – це наша колежанка з організації «Блакитний птах», яка надає холістичну психологічну допомогу жертвам катувань від початку російської агресії в Україні. І, Наталю, ми чули вже від потерпілих, наскільки важливою для них є стала психологічна підтримка, наряду так само з фінансовою підтримкою. Чи могли б ви трошки більше розказати про ваш досвід спілкування з потерпілими, як надання такої підтримки відбувалось, і які далі, можливо, поради є саме щодо психологічної підтримки та фінансової, які б ви могли надати для майбутніх репараційних програм? Дякую.
Доброго дня. Тут важливо розуміти, що постраждалі від сексуального насилля, пов'язаного з конфліктом, досить часто потерпають і від інших злочинів, пов'язаних з сексуальним насиллям, пов'язаним з конфліктом. Переважна більшість випадків сексуального насильства, з якими ми стикаємося в нашій організації до моменту повномасштабного вторгнення 24 лютого, відбулися в місцях несвободи на тимчасово окупованих територіях Донецької та Луганської областей. Ці люди, які постраждалі, вони, частина з них мають довготривалі психологічні та фізичні наслідки. І їм досить часто, окрім цього насилля, вони потерпали від інших злочинів, таких як свавільне затримання, довготривале утримання, різного роду тортури перенесли, довготривалий психологічний тиск. І тому фактично їм після звільнення їм потрібно починати все життя спочатку. Ми в нашій організації до цього ставимося як до комплексного підходу, тому що Ми надаємо психологічну, юридичну, соціальну допомогу, також надаємо допомогу медикаментами, тому що без іншого, все ж таки без вирішення інших проблем цих людей процес реабілітації не буде ефективним. Для самих постраждалих вони фактично змушені розпочинати життя спочатку, і їм досить часто важко це зробити через те, що в них фактично немає ніяких базових умов для цього. Марина вже сказала, що там немає житла, немає роботи, а інколи навіть немає підтримки рідних, тому що рідні не змогли виїхати з тимчасово окупованих територій, це достатньо складно це зробити. Тому саме ми підходимо до цього комплексно проблем і намагаємося допомагати комплексно.
Дуже дякуємо, пані Наталія. І, колеги, наша заключна спікерка, пані Катерина Левченко, урядова уповноважена з питань гендерної рівності, приєднується до нас онлайн. І ми дуже би хотіли почути від пані Катерини те, наскільки зараз уряд України, влада України, по-перше, співпрацює з потерпілими, і які, можливо, вже проєкти державних політик по допомозі індивідуальним постраждалим від збройної агресії Російської Федерації вже є в Києві. Пані Катерино.
Доброго дня, шановні колеги, шановні колежанки. Дякую Global Survival Fund за організацію запрошення і питання репарацій для постраждалих від сексуального насильства є дуже важливим. І відразу хочу сказати, що уряд відкритий до співпраці, в тому числі до спільного опрацювання звіту, який підготовлений, тому що він містить чимало конструктивних пропозицій і оцінок щодо ситуації, яка є в цій сфері. Водночас я з самого початку хочу звернути на важливість використання коректної термінології, і термінологія, яка нас відсилає до російських наративів, коли говориться про armed conflict and east of Ukraine, вводить в оману і тих, хто читає звіт, і світове товариство щодо того, що війна проти України почалася в 2014 році. І некоректне визнання, в тому числі на міжнародному рівні, цієї ситуації призвело до того, що і досі ми маємо проблеми з застосуванням норм міжнародного права, і в тому числі виплатою репарації, компенсацій тим, хто постраждав. Бо Росію ж не хотіли бачити стороною цього конфлікту, як зазначається в цьому звіті. Тому коректність термінології, вона допомагає в тому числі і надавати допомогу постраждалим. Я хочу повідомити всіх, що 2 тижні тому парламент України ратифікував дуже важливий документ, Конвенцію Ради Європи про запобігання та боротьбу з насильством стосовно жінок та домашнім насильством, яка відома як Стамбульська конвенція. І ви знаєте, що ця конвенція працює не тільки в мирний час, а і під час війни і міжнародних збройних конфліктів. І для нас це якраз є ознака того, що питання захисту постраждалих знаходяться в центрі уваги уряду, бо це одна з тих основних колон, на яких базується Стамбульська конвенція. Для того, щоб забезпечити надання допомоги постраждалим, за ініціативи віце-прем'єр-міністерки з питань європейської та євроатлантичної інтеграції пані Ольги Стефанішиної спільно зі мною і при підтримці Фонду народного населення ООН відкрито перший центр допомоги врятованим. Це зроблено в місті Запоріжжя, в тому місті, яке найближче з обласних міст до лінії розмежування, куди постійно прибувають наші громадяни з тимчасово окупованих Російською Федерацією територій Херсонської, Запорізької, а також Донецької областей. І ця робота центру направлена якраз на надання допомоги постраждалим, перш за все психологічної, правової, подальшого перенаправлення до тих установ, де вони можуть отримати поглиблену і медичну, в тому числі, допомогу. Спільно також з Фондом народонаселення ООН уряд створив мережу онлайн психотерапевтичної допомоги для постраждалих від сексуального насильства, пов'язаного з конфліктом, яка називається «Аврора». Можна онлайн заповнити заявку і отримати кваліфіковану допомогу психотерапевтів, причому не одноразово, а стільки, скільки це потребує, саме для того, щоб відновити той складний психологічний стан постраждалих, якому ми знаємо, вони перебувають. Комплексний підхід до надання допомоги постраждалим від сексуального насильства, пов'язаного з конфліктом, відзначено і в підписаному урядом меморандумі спільно з Організацією Об'єднаних Націй від імені ООН. Цей меморандум підписаний спеціальною доповідачкою ООН Промілою Патен. І, як зазначається в меморандумі, ті завдання, які поставлені в ньому, мають знайти відображення для подальшої реалізації в оновленому національному плані дій 1325 «Жінки, мир, безпека». Дуже оперативно в червні місяці ми провели стратегічні сесії планувальна спільно з громадськими організаціями, міжнародними партнерами. І наразі перший варіант оновленого плану готовий. На наступному тижні плануються громадські обговорення, і я запрошую представників організації «Сема» провести експертизу запропонованих змін, а також взяти участь в громадських обговореннях та надати пропозиції уряду для того, щоб всі проблеми, питання, інтереси постраждалих від сексуального насильства були враховані. Також ми дуже щільно працюємо з організаціями в рамках міжвідомчої групи з питань протидії сексуальному насильству, пов'язаному з конфліктами, надання допомоги постраждалим, яка була створена в червні, і питання співпраці з Промілою Патен, питання оновлення 1325, питання координації зусиль правоохоронних органів, а також забезпечення змін до законодавства для того, щоб можна було виплачувати репарації. Це все коло питань, які є в компетенції цієї робочої групи.
Пані Катерино, ми дуже дякуємо вам за ваш час. На жаль, маємо вже переключатись до наступної панелі наших спікерів, але ми також висловлюємо велике. We're also very hopeful that as Ukraine has finally ratified the Istanbul Convention, the ratification of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court will follow because it allows for the wider victim representation and more insightful examination of conflict-related sexual violence by the International Criminal Court. And we are also hoping that the President of Ukraine signs the amendments to the Criminal Code, namely the draft law 2689, which is one of the recommendations of the study, to ensure the more nuanced and stronger conflict-related proceedings, namely the proceedings on war crimes and crimes against humanity, including sexual violence in Ukraine's domestic courts, because we know that the major chunk of the justice efforts will take place domestically, and this is one of the important reparations needs for the survivors, as we have heard today. Dear colleagues, we are now moving to the third panel, and we will look closer at the efforts taken by the Ukrainian authorities to establish a reparation system, as well as the prospects of its implementation. And I'm kindly inviting Mr. Volodymyr Shcherbachenko and Clara Sandoval, who are joining here in person, and Ms. Anna Tishchenko will be joining online. Thank you. Volodymyr, my first question is to you. Volodymyr is the head of the Eastern-Ukrainian Center for Civic Initiatives, and it must be stressed that his organization was the first, not just among the Ukrainian state stakeholders, but actually among the Ukrainian human rights NGOs who singled out sexual violence as a particular issue in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and they were the first to document this type of violence and to provide very insightful analysis on it, and I call on you to look into their publications on their website. So, Volodymyr, given your very long-standing engagement with the survivors, could you explain a little bit how does your organization see the reparations process for the Ukrainian survivors? Thank you.
Дякую за надану можливість висловити свій погляд. Ми документуємо ці злочини, починаючи з 2014 року. І я дуже радий, що вийшла в світ ця публікація, оскільки всі ці проблеми, фактично ми їх чуємо щодня. Ми задокументували в спілкуванні в безпосередньому з кількома сотнями постраждалих їх ситуацію. І я задоволений тим, що, знаєте, вийшла ця публікація, де всі ці погляди, всі ці проблеми, всі негаразди, з якими стикаються врятовані, от вони представлені в одній публікації, дуже важливий крок вперед. На жаль, ці питання, вони зараз постали перед, якби так, більш загострено на них звертається увага з точки зору міжнародної спільноти, засоби масової інформації. В Україні злочини ці в контексті війни почали з'являтися 2014-2015 рік. В 2017-2018 році вийшов звіт моніторингової місії ООН і нашої організації. І десь роки за два про це почали говорити урядові структури. Причому на досить такому високому рівні, це і віце-прем'єр, і віце-спікер парламенту, тобто визнання того, що така категорія постраждалих в Україні з боку уряду є. І про це говорять вже як роки 4-5. На жаль, не так багато зроблено для того, щоб це відобразилось в форматі конкретної допомоги для постраждалих. І вже 8-й рік війни, за цей час уряд спромігся визнати і заснувати програми для внутрішньопереміщених осіб. Є така категорія постраждалих, є виплати для них від держави, є програми допомоги. Є така категорія постраждалих, визнає окремі документи для тих, хто утримувався в місцях несвободи. Визнана така категорія, є їм певні програми допомоги. Є така категорія постраждалих, як люди, які отримали інвалідність внаслідок війни. Є програми для допомоги для ветеранів, тих людей, які захищають нашу країну. Для інших категорій немає лише допомоги для постраждалих від сексуального насильства. Я не хотів би, знаєте, демонізувати український уряд, тобто ми не єдині, Україна в такому порядку визнання постраждалих від сексуального насильства. Скоріше, тут це така, на жаль, сумна тенденція. Люди, окрема категорія жінок, чоловіків, які пройшли через цей дуже специфічний вид насильства, вони, на жаль, до сих пір не визнані урядом в формі окремої категорії постраждалих і не засновані специфічні програми допомоги цим людям. Час це зробити. Час не лише говорити, ось ці люди, вони постраждали від російської армії, ми солідарні з ними. Час від слів перейти до конкретних дій. Ось ми зараз на цьому етапі. Я дуже сподіваюся, що цей звіт і подальша робота, вони допоможуть зробити цей важливий крок.
Володимире, дякуємо вам дуже. Дійсно, приємно бачити поступ на рівні полісі, національних політик. Зокрема, пані Катерина згадувала національний план дій «Жінки, мир, безпека», де напряму говориться про різні категорії потерпілих від сексуального насильства, не лише жінки та дівчата, але й хлопчики і чоловіки, про активне залучення потерпілих до процесів перехідного правосуддя, яким, як не дивно, Україна займається з 2019 року. Але дійсно дуже важливо, щоб ці бажання політичні, щоб вони перейшли вже нарешті в стадію імплементації. Колеги, ми зараз приєднуємось до спікерки Анни Тищенко, яка є директоркою відділу з питань міжнародних спорів Міністерства юстиції України. І, пані Анно, ми хотіли би від вас почути трохи більше про доволі обнадійливу новину від президента Зеленського щодо створення спеціального компенсаційного фонду для України. Наскільки ці компенсації стосуватимуться не лише відновлення інфраструктури України, а будуть спрямовані на потреби індивідуальних потерпілих від найтяжчих злочинів, зокрема сексуального насильства. Пані Анно, слово вам.
So can you hear me now? Because I was muted. You do, right? Can you hear me?
Ми вас чуємо.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me today on this event. And it is true, being a director of the Department of International Disputes in the Ministry of Justice of Ukraine, I'm responsible for international arena. The President of Ukraine challenged the Ministry of Justice with a very important and I would say difficult task. It is to bring Russian Federation to responsibility in a very practical means, to make it to pay for what it is doing now in our country. And our task is quite wide. So it concerns compensation for the damages that individuals suffer and also for the damages suffered by legal entities and the state itself. I'm very grateful to Esther because when we meet at the end of April, beginning of May, she brought this particular violence, this particular crimes against our people to our attention, and we made a special focus in our work since that time. So first of all, when President launched this initiative, he issued a special decree creating a working group who is tasked with creation of such international mechanism for making Russia responsible. Representatives of government of Ukraine are the members of such working group, both the Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, also representatives of the Office of the President, because they need to control it, Ukrainian lawyers, and also specialists in international law. I should say that I will not go into deep, but I should say that challenges that we are facing are really big. It's because the same as our country is fighting Russian troops and Russia's assets that are much bigger than Ukrainians. It is the same. We are battling against very strong and aggressive opponent also in the international arena. So our work have been active for I think almost since the beginning of the aggression, and it concerns not only study and work with lawyers in the states where Russian assets are seized and freezed, but also a diplomatic work of negotiations and intensive negotiations all over the world with representatives of the states who already in the framework of sanctions freeze the assets of Russian Federation, but also of the proxies to Putin regimes, tycoons, and some other Russian residents. And while we are working on creation of this mechanism, which should be done via signing of a big international treaty, with a number of participant states, so not only Ukraine, but also those states who hold Russian assets freezed. Apart from creating this treaty, we started to search for the best practices, and also taking into account our meeting with Erdingimas. So we are actively studying the experiences of the most successful examples of I would say international mechanisms that made real payments, such as Iran US Claims Tribunal, and of course United Nations Claims Commission that was created after the war that Iraq launched in Kuwait. And I would say that after the research that we made, we decided that this example of UN Compensation Commission is the best example, and we are going to take as much of the best practices as possible from that commission. It is very important, I think, and it was stressed by speakers before me that, of course, for victims of sexual violence, it is very important to make those who committed it to responsibility. But I should say that our army, well, is doing it, and many those who are guilty of these heinous crimes are already killed or will be killed during the conflict. But we all know that compensation and monetary compensation is also very, very important. And Marina, who was speaking in the very beginning, I think that when she said what she had to face is very important. It shows that victims of sexual assaults, they are also very frequently victims of other damages like personal injuries, loss of residence. Sometimes they need to become refugees and move from the places where they used to live. And so the example which we are considering, it had several categories of claims. And there was a special category, category C, but it doesn't, it's not really important how it was called, but it also included claims, compensations, compensations for, as it was called, mental pain and anguish. Even if it was called mental pain and anguish, in truth, it included also compensations, to those people who suffered from sexual assault or who had to witness these crimes committed to their beloved ones, like spouses, children, or parents. And this category of claims received compensation up to $100 US. So, and in some instances, it was mostly those cases where it was also other kinds of injuries. So there were special guidelines created for each category of cases that the Commission was hearing. And for each of these categories, there were special, I should say, rules, guidelines, how they evaluate them and how they calculate compensation to be paid. And it included both pecuniary losses and non-pecuniary loss injuries. What is very important is that United Nations Claims Commission, when it came to category C claims, almost 99.7% of the claims were successful. So because what we are interested is not just creation of the mechanism, but real work of this mechanism, and we want to ensure that people who will file their claims with our help to that fund, they will be successful. So this example is really what gives us inspiration. So 99.7% of successful claimants, and the amount that was paid was, I think it was in billions of dollars.
Dear Ms. Tishchenko, thank you very much for providing more insight into the modalities of the possible compensation fund, as well as really proving that the Ukrainian government is looking at the possibilities of defining the victimization of both the legal persons and physical persons and specific types of survivors. So it sounds quite hopeful. But now that was a more still long-term perspective, and I've got a question to Clara Sandoval, our GSF's Director of Program, about the quicker, prompter measures that could be established to help survivors while the conflict is ongoing, and which would not require such a long, elaborate procedure. What recommendations would you give to Ukraine?
Thank you so much. I really welcome the presentation that took place before, because it allows us to understand how Ukraine is looking at reparations. We need to engage in that conversation, and we are doing that actively at GSF. But let me say something about that. Setting up such a UN compensation commission for Ukraine is something that is going to take time, that is only looking at compensation, when what survivors need and want is today, is now. They need rehabilitation measures, they need access to compensation, they need access to other services, they need access to restitution, housing, etc. And the question for us is, how can we act on that? How can we act on that in Ukraine when remedies, really remedies, tangible remedies that survivors can use are not in place? So we need to start at home, before we think about setting up other major mechanisms. And those mechanisms that can be triggered by the working group that has been put in place by the Ukrainian government needs to think about interim reparative measures. And here what I am talking about, most reparations have come down the line, 10, 15, 20 years down the line. Ukraine is putting in front of us a unique opportunity to act in real time today, because it has expressed its will to act, to provide reparations to survivors, and we have an international community of states also recognizing the same. We have the civil society, bodies, institutions that are able to help survivors, and we have amazing heroes here in front of me really speaking out and helping us to think, how can we bring survivors to the board, to the center, so that they can speak and say to us how we can provide reparations. So I think that's a unique ecosystem to facilitate urgent interim reparative measures, which have taken place in very few countries around the world. I can think of places like South Africa or East Timor, but not necessarily in the most successful manner. Again, we have things in Ukraine that are not in other places that can make them effective, not only possible, but effective. What do we need? A survivor-centered approach, and for that, we need an enabling system. And part of that enabling system are some of the elements I mentioned. We need the organizations that would allow to create safe and trusted spaces for survivors to come forward and tell us where they are, what has happened to them, what do they think the risks and threats are, what are the opportunities, and how can we respond to that. But we are also connected to the state and to other actors that can actually say, this is the way to facilitate reparations, for example, in the form of rehabilitation measures for survivors in different places in Ukraine. So we need to think about how do we facilitate access to certain urgent measures, including compensation. They don't have, I really, really loved your presentation, Marina, because you really said, you put the question there, how do we start when we've lost everything? That is not only the harm that the body and the mind has suffered, is how it has really taken away from you or your ecosystem, the one that makes possible life, your relations, your family, your community, the livelihoods, the work, every single thing. So how can we work on that? We need that network of support that survivors are creating around them. So we need to activate them. We need then to provide them access with compensation, with rehabilitation measures, etc. But besides this urgent reparation system we began to put in place, we need to also set up a vision in relation to a major domestic reparation program that will cover survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, but that will also cover other survivors and other victims in the case of Ukraine. And for that, we need a registry of victims. We need to be able to take account of where the victims are, what happened to them. That is going to be not only a major element enabling reparations, but it's also going to be a key element in terms of memory, in terms of truth, in terms of facilitating efforts, crossing information. We also need to set up the fund. So the fund is only an element of the domestic reparation program. It's not the goal in itself. It's a means towards reparation. We need that too. But we also need to think very carefully about how we are going to finance the whole domestic reparation program, including the urgent interim reparation measures that must be provided today, tomorrow, for survivors. And that really needs, again, of this whole ecosystem I was mentioning before, that includes, of course, states and allies that are ready and willing to, for example, seize assets of those that have been confiscated and seized because they are sanctioned assets, so that these assets can be repurposed for the purposes of reparations. So there are various measures that can be taken already today because the opportunities are there to provide reparations today to survivors. So let's start now. My call is, how can we bring everyone that has expressed the will to provide reparations together so that we act? And I think, and we said this morning, but I really want to end up with this hopeful note. Ukraine is a unique opportunity to provide timely reparations to survivors. It can really change the history of how reparations are given, because the ecosystem, as my colleague Danae was saying the other day, the stars are aligned to make it happen. So it will be really sad not to see it materialize. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clara, for such a light, assertive message. And I think it's an important message not just to the Ukrainian government or to the survivors, but also to the international community, that Ukraine could be a blueprint for this prompt reaction. And as of now, we have heard that neither interim measures or simplified administrative reparation procedures are not available domestically, on the one hand. On the other hand, there are still debates whether in the course of the ongoing armed conflict there is still, the need to speak, the practical need and practical possibility to speak about reparations or the wider transitional justice. And it's great that all of us can hear more and more confirmations from survivors and experts here that it's not just possible, that it's needed now. And with this positive note, colleagues, we are turning to the final closing remarks with Mr. Norbert Wühler, with the Minister Councillor Kazuo Taguchi, and with Ms. Olena Sotnik, who will be joining online. Thank you. Colleagues, so our next speaker is Mr. Norbert Wühler, who is the senior reparations expert and who is also a board member of GSF. Over to you, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Excellencies, distinguished speakers, dear survivors, dear all. It has been very gratifying to be at this event where significant reflection and discussion has taken place. Okay. Where significant reflection has taken place around the challenges, but also the opportunities to provide reparations to survivors of conflict-related sexual violence in Ukraine. We have heard from all survivors present here today, as well as from the voices of survivors included in the report, that reparations need to be provided promptly to them. The report has important information on what kind of reparations survivors would prioritize and the reasons behind these choices. On the other hand, we have also heard about challenges that need to be overcome in Ukraine to make their right to reparations a reality for survivors. The roadmap for action is clear. I have worked for more than 30 years on reparations in many different countries. Many times, unfortunately, reparations have come late, or indeed too late, and often they have neglected victims of conflict-related sexual violence altogether. As was said just now by Clara, there is a unique opportunity here to break that pattern, since Ukraine has expressed its willingness to act on the matter now. The presence of Ukrainian government representatives here today, as well as that of other states, including Belgium, France, Japan, Korea, the United Kingdom, and the United States, confirms that the right to reparations for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence matters to them, and that they share the vision that it is crucial to work together towards fulfilling this right. Making reparations to survivors a reality is a challenging task for multiple reasons. It is difficult to secure financing for such programs, to ensure that survivors come forward and speak up, to organize the process in a timely manner, and to provide the appropriate services that can make a meaningful difference to the survivors' lives. And to do all of this during a conflict is even a bigger challenge than in other situations. But as others have remarked, the Ukrainian government is not alone in this endeavor. The international community, states present here today, civil society, and the Global Survivors Fund all stand ready to support this important mission. It is indeed encouraging to hear of the efforts of the Ukrainian government, that the Ukrainian government is undertaking to provide a holistic response to survivors of conflict-related sexual violence and to set up a compensation fund. Such will and efforts are often missing when reparations are at stake, but they are essential in laying the ground for a comprehensive program. What is required is a solid legal framework in the form of a decree or law or some other legal instrument, the establishment, Clara said it, of a register of victims, as well as the creation of a fund, among many other elements that need to come together. Clearly, working with survivors' networks of support would be crucial in Ukraine, as it is in other areas, to ensure that survivors have access to safe and trusted spaces where they can talk and share their views on reparations, and where they can feel protected from stigma. Such networks also play an important role in ensuring that the key forms of reparation highlighted by survivors and outlined in the report, including compensation and rehabilitation, are actually delivered to them. I invite the government of Ukraine and all those present here today to consider how best to enable a survivor-centered approach on the reparation work ahead. It is a challenge, but it is feasible. And it can both enhance access to reparations, but also increase the positive impact of reparation measures for the survivors. Finally, I want to note the important contribution that prosecutions and justice can make to reparations. As we heard, considerable accountability efforts are now underway in Ukraine as well as at the International Criminal Court to ensure that those guilty of the crimes that have taken place in Ukraine are prosecuted and brought to justice. These efforts could eventually also lead to reparations through courts and in these criminal proceedings. But importantly, those proceedings can also contribute to the ongoing work to set up a reparation program in Ukraine. If these activities are not seen in isolation but work together in harmony. Justice mechanisms can, for instance, help to document crimes and harms, and we heard that this is going on, or they can identify and register survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, another important contribution to reparations program. The connection that must exist between justice and reparation was well captured by one survivor who participated in the study and who said, reparation is the continuation of justice, or the completion, the logical completion of the justice process. Let me conclude by saying that this is probably the first time at an event on reparations for conflict-related sexual violence victims, where at such an important stage, I see with hope and optimism that the right pieces come together. The will of Ukraine to act, the solidarity expressed by the international community, the continuing support by civil society organizations, including the Global Survivors Fund, and a report that provides solid and rigorous information on what is required to make reparations accessible to survivors. The only thing that is needed now, it needs to happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bula. And we currently have Mr. Kazuo Taguchi, who is the Minister Counselor of the Permanent Mission of Japan to the international organizations in Geneva. It's over to you.
Thank you very much. Dear Excellency, dear distinguished guests, dear survivors, dear all. My name is Kazuo Taguchi, Minister Counselor of the Japanese Mission. Today, as a co-host member of this event by the Global Survivors Fund, I am honored to share a message on behalf of the government of Japan. We have heard today that sexual violence has occurred as part of the conflict in Ukraine since 2014 and is ongoing as a result of Russia's illegal and unjustifiable war of aggression against Ukraine. Japan strongly condemns these barbaric acts of violence against women, men, and children. These crimes have devastating impacts not only on victims, but also on their families and communities, and cannot be tolerated. As a board member of the Global Survivors Fund since its establishment in 2019, the government of Japan strongly supports GSF's mission to enhance access to various support for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence and its unique co-creation model and survivor-centered approach. As we have heard from the brave survivors and distinguished panelists who are with us today, victims need urgent medical, psychological, and economic support. They should not have to wait to get recognition and justice. By acting now to provide victims with urgent life-saving support and acknowledgement, Ukraine can not only avoid irreparable harm, but also set an important precedent for other countries to follow. The international community has a critical role to play for the reparation program that survivors in Ukraine have been calling for by drawing on existing expertise worldwide, providing technical assistance to the Ukrainian government and supporting that financing. We need to act together Through its continued support to Global Survivors Fund, Japan stands with Ukraine in its efforts. Japan will continue to work with the international community to eradicate conflict-related sexual violence and provide victims with the recognition and support they need. I hope that this event marks a turning point in cooperation amongst the states to recognize the importance of urgent action to support survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Taguchi. And colleagues, we've got our final speaker today, who's Ms. Olena Sotnik. She's the advisor to the Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister Olga Stefanishyna, who herself is the key government person for Ukraine's successful European integration. Ms. Olena Sotnik, over to you, please.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me here. First of all, I want to tell you that I'm not like occasionally here. I'm also a human rights defender, and I'm lawyer for several survivors in Ukraine. So I have practical understanding what is happening around and what kind of challenges survivors have when they're seeking for justice and for help. So first of all, I want to tell you that it was amazing, outstanding, and very important, very practical session, which gave me a lot of perspective what kind of steps we can do, both as a government, but also as a civil activists and human rights defenders. And I think that the main thing that our unity on this way to help survivors to bring back some kind of normality to their life, to come back to the normal life. It's very important, and that's our main role and mission. But also there are several things which is very important. First of all, trust. That's what I can tell you without any reports, without any analysis. Trust is very important. Trust of the survivors within the society, to the institutions, to the world in general. And this trust, it can come from, first of all, communication. So survivors, they need to know what kind of instrument they can use, who can help them, and how they can approach this help. But also accept trust actions is very important, are very important. We can talk a lot, but to set up a very concrete, practical roadmap is also very important. And there our unity, which I mentioned from the very beginning, also would be crucial. Except this, I would say that also empathy, the huge issue in our society. I mean, not just Ukrainian society, but the world, whole civilized world should demonstrate empathy to these people, because you can be a survivor of the sexual violence, but when you are a survivor of the sexual violence during the war, it's something different, because during the war, it is direct weapon of the Russian Federation against Ukrainians. It is a part of the whole idea of genocide of Ukrainian nation. And it's much more complicated, and it needs a lot of empathy from all the world to our Ukrainian people who suffered from this violence. And here, the next one, very important precondition, it's also part of the empathy, but the world should do something in order to stop this as soon as possible. Because we as a government and as a human rights defenders, our main goal now to help survivors, but I believe that the whole world should stop and prevent more and more victims in the future, which is already happening. Now, when we are talking together with you, we have like thousands of small butchers all around the Ukraine, where people suffering from violence, both sexual and other kinds of violence. And last one, very practical one. So any action, I know this from my long legal practice, and also I used to be member of the Parliament of Ukraine from policy practice. It's very important to have resources to implement your idea, to implement your support, and to give some practical value of everything what we are talking about. So in the government, we have the idea to set up special fund to help survivors with both medical support, psychological support, also economic support and legal support. I think this is 4 pillars which is crucial and which is needed. Of course, we can talk a lot about compensations and some kind of remunerations, but it's going to take a long time through the very bureaucratic procedures. But these 4 pillars which I mentioned, they need them now. And to provide them, of course, we need resources. That's why I would invite all the participants to continue this dialogue, not to stop here, but to continue this dialogue, to use this report as a practical tool, and to think about very practical use of this report, and to think about how we can practically support survivors, and what we are ready to do, how we can combine efforts, how we can provide some legal frameworks, and we as a government ready to provide this. And first of all, how we can be this first hand for survivors, and how we can help them from the very beginning to overcome all the negative aspects of this very traumatic experience, and just to protect further violations and further victims. Thank you for having me. We are open for the further cooperation. And one more time, I invite you to think about very practical steps, some kind of plan, a roadmap to set up very practical fund for the survivors, and to provide these 4 pillars which I mentioned earlier. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sotnik, and it was a brilliant conclusion to our discussion today, because on the one hand we all agree on the fact that Ukraine could be a blueprint for itself as a country, but it could be also a blueprint for the world in terms of the immediate action for the survivors while the conflict is ongoing. It's also quite symbolic that, as I mentioned, Ms. Sotnik is an advisor to the Deputy Prime Minister who's responsible for Ukraine's European integration, to which the human-centric approach to all policies, including the post-conflict recovery, is a key. So I hope that this idea of proactive empathy on behalf of the government, on behalf of the civil society, and on behalf of Ukraine's international partners is something that would lead the reparations policy further. Dear colleagues, thank you very much for your participation today. We are concluding this panel, but I kindly ask the members of the audience to stay, and those who are willing to proceed with a Q&A session, we could do so in the next couple of minutes. We are also gathering the questions from Zoom, so those of you who are joining us online, you're also welcome to submit your questions. Thank you very much for your participation today. So we have currently received 2 questions from Zoom, and perhaps I'll just voice them, and then those of our speakers who are willing to comment are most welcome to take over the question. So the first question is as follows: how to strengthen redress and reparations delivered by courts, either in Ukraine or abroad, based on universal jurisdiction, until a proper administrative reparation program is set up. So, what redress could be possible in the proceedings, in the universal jurisdiction proceedings, meaning, as we know, the proceedings concerning a particular case which are not necessarily connected with the jurisdiction where the trial is going, and what sort of redress or reparation should be available there, potentially for Ukrainian survivors?
Thank you, Katerina. Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and I think I'm only going to point out to one finding from the study, where we looked actually at the link between the prosecution of conflict-related sexual violence and reparations. And in several legal or jurisdictions around the world, the courts can, in a criminal case, award victims of those crimes with reparations. But that does not exist in Ukraine. The legal framework does not allow courts to, at the end of a prosecution, if the person who was accused of conflict-related sexual violence was found guilty, the court would just sentence that person to imprisonment or what the legal code states, but it will not award victims with reparations. So a clear thing that we actually, a clear proposal that we put is that the Ukrainian legislators should think about this legal framework, and we recommend actually amending it to allow for the provision of reparations or the awarding of reparations linked to the prosecution of cases. But we also have to stress that reparations are better advanced through an administrative reparation program, because there can only be a limited number of prosecutions at the best of times. So that will not in any way be able to capture the large number, and we've heard it today continuously. We are talking about thousands of survivors of sexual violence alone, and of course the justice system has to deal with all crimes of the conflict. So an administrative program will better advance the reparation agenda, but we should make court-awarded reparations also available, and we recommend doing that in the study as well.
Thank you very much, Amal. And I just thought that it could also be a very strong argument for other states that are looking into the violations related to the armed conflict in Ukraine under the universal jurisdiction framework to actually, proceed with those proceedings quicker, because if they provide reparations domestically and the Ukrainian survivors don't get them here on the ground, perhaps that could be a bigger catalyst for those proceedings until the administrative programs are set up in Ukraine domestically. I was wondering, did you?
Could I add to that? I think that there is a very important concept, and I'm going to be here very much a lawyer, and it's the idea of an adequate and effective remedy. And when we are facing systematic human rights violations and serious violations of humanitarian law, we need to think about the effectiveness, and the effective remedy there is a domestic reparation program. We need to have in place also judicial remedies, so don't get me wrong. We need criminal systems able to award reparations, of course, and we need civil courts also able to award reparations against the states. Those remedies need to coexist, but the effective remedy in terms of accessibility for victims is a domestic reparation program. Let me give you two examples for you to see what I am talking about and for you to consider well where to put your efforts now that reparation is at stake. Take the case of Taganda, and I look here at Norbert, who was one of the experts before the ICC, exactly looking at reparations, including for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. The situation in Taganda that happened in Ituri, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, takes us back to 2002 and 2003. That's when the facts took place. The decision on reparations came out a year and a half ago. The decision on reparations, so almost 20 years fighting for justice internationally to secure a judgment on reparations that is only in the process of beginning to be implemented. That is not the justice that survivors of conflict-related sexual violence need. They need action today. They cannot wait for 20 years for their bodies to be repaired, for the psychological harm to be addressed, for them to have access to a new opportunity in life to really bounce back. And if I tell you of another countries in the world, think about Colombia, where an enormous amount of money was put into the justice and peace law system before the Colombian peace agreement in 2016. How many judgments we have against perpetrators there? We have about 70 to 80 judgments. Only 70 to 80 judgments. We have more than 5,000 perpetrators to process. I was in a webinar, and that means that to get to reparations, count the time. And if you ask me how many of the reparations that have been ordered by the courts in Colombia under the Justice and Peace Law have been implemented, a tiny, tiny proportion. There are calculus that it will take more than 70 years to process all of these people, all of these perpetrators. I was listening in a webinar last week that we also jointly co-organized with the US as a side event to the Human Rights Council sessions on accountability, prevention, and reparative justice. One of your colleagues in Ukraine saying that there are more than 15,000 cases currently under investigation. The number continues to grow now before the justice system in Ukraine. There is no justice system in the midst of a conflict, not least in peace, capable of processing those cases and at the same time awarding reparation. So we really need to think carefully how we use the various remedies, so don't get me wrong, we need to use them. But the way we can respond to survivors today and now is through a domestic reparation program.
Thank you very much.
Да, is it a translation?
Do we still have the translation from Ukrainian?
Я хотів би так само приєднатися до колег, і мене до тієї думки, що зміни потрібні в Україні, і немає нічого гіршого, аніж через 15 років побачити цих жінок, які скажуть, пройшло 20 років від того часу, як ми постраждали, але ми все чекаємо на справедливість. І слухаючи пані Сотник, мене от, знаєте, трохи здивувало, і я б сказав, це викликає обурення, коли ми закликаємо міжнародну спільноту, давайте допомагати, давайте створювати фонди, давайте гроші давати для того, щоб допомагати українським постраждалим. Це правильно, але коли будуть слова від українських посадовців, ми визнаємо цих постраждалих уже протягом 3 місяців чи 6, ми внесемо зміни в законодавство, хоча б надамо статус цим людям, визнаємо їх існування не лише на словах, але в законах. І, на жаль, фокус в тому, що я чув, він якось зміщується, знову перекладається відповідальність на міжнародну спільноту. Ми надзвичайно цінуємо ці зусилля і просимо продовжувати нам допомагати. Але є та робота, яку мають зробити українські посадовці. Будь ласка, робіть її.
Дякуємо дуже, Володимире, і за цей заклик, і за зміни в законодавство, які потрібні для нормального розслідування проваджень, пов'язаних з конфліктами, звісно, за національні спрощені програми надання репарацій, за адміністративні програми. І якщо можна, Володимире, теж адресую друге запитання від нашої онлайн-аудиторії вам. Запитання наступне. Як найліпше організувати доступ до репарацій для тих потерпілих з України, які виїхали за кордон?
Марина виїхала, напевно, найкраще спитати у неї.
Я одна из тех, кто выехал, и как я могу здесь начать работать, не имея документов? Как я могу здесь начать работать, не зная языка? Как я могу выучить язык, когда мне уже за 50? Как я могу пойти куда-то, если я не знаю куда? Поэтому мне очень просто нужна, необходимо и хочется, и все-таки я считаю, что, то есть я не считаю, а не хочу слышать, что я жертва, я хочу слышать, что я делала шаги, делала попытки, что я стремилась к тому, чтобы война не пошла дальше, ведь Путин не остановился, и все продолжается, бомбежки продолжаются. Поэтому мне бы очень хотелось, чтобы меня поддержали, мне бы очень хотелось, чтобы со мной были люди рядом, которые бы мне помогли, мне и таким другим. Первый вопрос – жилье. Ничего не начинается с того, когда ты говоришь, что я дома, хочется где-то обосноваться. У меня совершенно нет вещей, я приехала с одним чемоданом, у меня нет вообще ничего, то есть просто я. Мне хочется выучить язык, чтобы мне помогли обеспечить какие-то курсы, чтобы я могла пройти и быстренько выучить язык, чтобы я смогла работать не на той профессии, которая у меня есть опыт работы, а которую я могу работать без такого хорошего знания языка. Я бы хотела, возможно, какие-то тренинги, курсы, переобучение. Я бы хотела, есть еще такая у меня идея, что возможно организовать женщины Украины, переехавшие сюда, за границу, может быть, организовать как бы что-то handmade, кто что умеет делать, и какие-то выставки с продажами. Такие вот идеи у меня возникают. Ну, не знаю, много еще вариантов, ну, подскажите, что... Курсы. Ну, деньги, конечно, нужны, потому что я в другой стране приехала, денег нет, ну, мне не стыдно сказать, потому что мне нужно купить буквально все. Зубную пасту и шампунь. Так что простите меня, пожалуйста, ну, вот так вот.
Дякуємо, Марино. Dear colleagues, do we have any further questions? Just one more. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Drawing upon that, I was wondering if there were already existing examples of ways to provide support for survivors abroad. You mentioned that domestic reparation programs were the most effective way forward, but to what extent can they account for survivors that have had to seek refuge abroad?
I think that's a very important question, and given the context we're in, where many survivors are abroad, it really is something that we should explore a little bit more. Of course, the survivors who are now present in the different countries that they arrived in will be ideally under the care of these governments, who would put in place responses that also provide them with the help and support that they need. And it is also something that we recommend in our study, that it's not going to be enough to just treat all of the Ukrainians who are arriving in these countries as just, you know, one uniform group. There are different needs, different demands, and it's important to know that the needs of survivors of sexual violence will be perhaps, or most likely, different. They will require additional support. So that is going to, when we're looking at the humanitarian assistance response in these different countries, it really needs to adopt victim-centered and centric approach to the delivery of these services. It's not going to be reparations, but it can offer an important starting point and an urgent step, so that those needs are not left unaddressed, and then we're not causing irreparable harm. But that is something we explore briefly in the report and recommend.
Thank you very much, Amal, and thank you very much, colleagues. We still have one more question. We take one last question, and then we wrap it up.
Thank you very much. My name is Catherine Ageno from Uganda. One of the findings, the main findings of the study, is that survivors actually need acknowledgement of what has been done to them, and to know that the duty bearers are actually taking responsibility for reparations. And one of the challenges that Mr. Wooler cited is that of actually finding funds in doing this work of helping the survivors. Are there any efforts, and I can't ask this of the Ukrainian government, but I'm asking the Global Survivors Fund as an independent body, are there any efforts to actually reach out to the Russian government? Because doing all this is like dancing before the blind or singing for the deaf. So are there any efforts at all to reach out to the other party of the conflict? Because conflict has two parties. So it would be unfair for the Ukrainian government alone to incur this cost of reparations. So I'm wondering if there are any such efforts to reach out to the Russian government. Thank you.
Ну, я знаю, що українські юристи з 2014 року роблять спроби всіляко притягнути російський уряд і військових їхніх до відповідальності. Я скажу більше, що довгий час в середовищі як самих постраждалих, так і правозахисників українських, ну і взагалі активістів. Ми взагалі не бачили український уряд як такий, не покладали на нього відповідальність, оскільки для нас абсолютно зрозуміла була причина цієї війни і початкове джерело цих проблем – це Російська Федерація. І це згодом якесь з'явилось розуміння того, що і наш уряд має, ну, все-таки громадяни наші, і жінки наші, і чоловіки, і він має, ну, якось підтримувати. Але серед нас, ну, існує чітке розуміння того, що якби основна відповідальність лежить саме на Російській Федерації. На жаль, ті спроби, скажімо так, правові, які робилися, я не можу говорити про уряд, скажу про правозахисників, звертатися з листами, з запитами до російської сторони, до російських структур, вони, ну, не знаходили відповіді належної, тобто та сторона всіляко заперечує свою відповідальність і намагається уникати. І, ну, на жаль, ситуація така, що поки світове співтовариство, міжнародна спільнота не поставить цю країну, на жаль, дуже потужно в певні рамки, не змусить їх поважати міжнародний закон, складно говорити про якусь їх реальну участь в репараціях. Звичайно, будуть уникати, допоки, ну, не буде створена якась в світовому масштабі система, яка дозволить притягати подібні країни і їх війська до відповідальності.
Amal, you wanted to add?
Just to complement what Volodymyr said, I mean, the reality is the Russian Federation not only, I mean, every time there has been coverage of the atrocities that happened this year, for instance, in Ukraine, they said these are actors, this is not real. So not only do they not want to repair the crimes, the harm of the crimes, they also do not acknowledge the crimes to start with. And that's a very difficult starting point for us to address the obligation of the Russian Federation as a party to the conflict, as a responsible party for these crimes. That said, we do make recommendations to the Russian Federation that you'll find in the report. Amongst them is to cease the military action in Ukraine and to meet their international obligations, and we do indeed remind them of those obligations, including accountability, but also the provision of reparations. We do it also in a realistic way when we talk to the international community. While we remind Russia of its obligations, we remind the international community, and we have every hint this year and from before, in fact, that the Russian obligation will not meet those obligations voluntarily. So we need to work creatively to force these obligations to be met. I just want to say, for example, one of the examples we mentioned in the report of the Russian obligation, you know, Russian obligations unwillingness of meeting its obligation is that, you know, they just left the Council of Europe, they were just removed from the Human Rights Council, they refused to cooperate with the ICC or with any other UN international body. So they are not giving us strong signs that they will meet our recommendations, but indeed we are sober in making these recommendations, and we are calling on the international community to bridge this gap.
Okay, no, but then just to add to all of that, because I fully agree, is the issue about symbolic justice. And they might not be recognizing responsibility now, but here is where we need accountability to happen. This is the role of accountability, bringing those most responsible to account for what they've done, and then obtaining reparations at that level. So that case and the initiation of court proceedings in relation to that is super important, because even if they don't recognize responsibility, we need others to say, you know, very clearly that they are responsible for all of these atrocities.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Vula, I know you also had a comment.
I would just add to that. and not disputing Russia's responsibility, not sort of diminishing efforts to make Russia pay for what it has done. I can tell you I'm in two groups at the moment. I'm a lawyer. I'm in two groups that are doing nothing but trying to find an avenue through these difficult legal ways to try and make this happen and to do something with the assets that have been attached, for instance, because they're sitting there, but they're not used and released at the moment. My advice would be for the survivors we are talking about today, let these people make these efforts, let them go ahead. Maybe they will lead to something, maybe not. As we speak, as you know, for the last 2 days or so in Lugano, there has been the first reconstruction conference where a figure has been put out of the needs for Ukraine to rehabilitate and reconstruct sort of up to $720 billion. There will be humongous efforts to do this. How this, comparatively speaking, in money terms, smaller effort will fit into that or can be put into that, I would just leave that aside. My advice would be, for the survivors we're talking about here now, take the money from where you can get it and take it now. Whether it's the Ukrainian government, whether it's others who are contributing, take it now and make this happen, and don't try to link it into these massive efforts that are going on at the moment, that some will lead to massive financial contributions, some will lead to very difficult legal avenues, but forget about that now for these kind of survivors and do what can be done now with the money that can be gotten now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wüller, and thank you very much to all of you today. And I would like to conclude with one of the voices of our survivors actually put in the studies, when she said that for her, one of the most important forms of reparation would be for her children not to experience war. And Ukraine is experiencing the shocking escalation now. And this is public information. I can say that at least 2 members of the SEMA network, women and mothers, and one of them is like myself in her early 30s, now put their civilian jobs aside and have joined the army. And this is them, the survivors, who are implementing that wish that their children live without war. So being inspired by that example of extraordinary, not just women, but female survivors of sexual violence who joined the army to fight again against those who victimize them, I think that us, as the civil society, as lawyers, as the Ukrainian government, and as the international community should be led by their example and should act now and introduce this first administrative reparations and then the wider but not postponed reparation programs for this change to be implemented on the ground. Thank you very much for your support, and the report will be also available in Ukrainian and in Russian in the course of a week, and the Russian version would be there in a month. Thank you very much.